So today I will be presenting the seventh essay of the phenomenon of life. The title is Image Making and the Freedom of Man. Now, here Jonas sets this chapter up with a very interesting twist. So he starts with imagining explorers on another planet who are trying to figure out whether there are people on that planet, whether there are creatures that we could call man. And he asked the question, what would be the best sign of the presence of people there? And there he says that the best way to, the most certain sign would be any kind of likeness, any kind of image that we would find. And here he says that it doesn't matter what kind of image these explorers would find, it doesn't matter how sophisticated it would be. In fact, as he puts it, the most childish drawing would be just as conclusive as the frescoes of Michelangelo. Any kind of an image, any kind of a mere representation of something else would be enough, would be a perfect proof of the more than animal nature, the symbolical being of the creatures that created that representation. Especially because mere representation, as he puts it, is biologically useless, which is this whole aspect of biological usefulness and uselessness is something that I suppose we'll get into in the discussion. It's definitely something that raises quite a few questions. But now, to continue with the actual text, he then defines the notion of the image. He does this in a number of paragraphs. I don't remember how many exactly, 7 or 8 or something. And I took the liberty of significantly shortening this into a very concise definition. So, to put it as simply as possible, an image is an intentional incomplete likeness, or rather an intentionally incomplete likeness. So it is a likeness of something else. That much should be fairly obvious. And this likeness is intentional, because of course an accidental footprint is not an image, and it is also incomplete. If it were a complete likeness, it would be a copy, a duplicate of a replica of the thing it perfectly resembles. But of course, an image isn't a complete likeness. It only has to resemble what it represents in a particular way to a certain extent. And this is something that he'll go on to talk about a bit later. For now, a few more things that he highlights is that the causality and substantiality of the image are submerged in its symbolic aspect. So again, here we can look at the difference between the image and the footprint, for example. So the footprint is, in a way, the image of the foot that created it, but it's not an actual image insofar as it is a simple physical effect where we can see it as a physical effect. The causality is essentially brought into the foreground here. Whereas with the image, the causality is in one way or another submerged. It is not in the foreground. It can be betrayed. So, for example, with painting, there are certain styles that utilize very specific and recognizable brush strokes. And with those styles, paintings betray the causality of their own becoming in a way, but nevertheless, they don't represent that causality. That causality in the brush strokes is just an additional element of the painting, an additional element that marks it as being of a particular style. Now here he gets into an interesting tripartite definition of image, substratum, and the thing represented. Here's a short quote on this. The difference between image and imaging thing, with the latter's self-effacement in the former, is matched by the difference between image and imaged object. The complete articulation is threefold. The substratum can be regarded by itself, the image by itself, the object of the image by itself. The image or likeness hovers as a third ideal entity between the first and the last, both real entities, connecting them in the unique way of representation. It is this double distinction, or the threefold stratification, which makes it possible for the image to enjoy the described mode of a non-causal presence, exempt from the accidents of real event. So the basic schema here is tripartite. We have the image, we have the carrier, and we have the object. And this is crucial for the image being able to function as an image. So the difference between the image and its substratum, its carrier, is what enables there to be something such as a reproduction of an image. So if we copy or reproduce an image, a painting, what we get is essentially not an image of an image, but rather a reproduction of the same image, which is enabled by the difference between the image and the carrier. On the other hand, the difference between the image and the thing represented enables there to be different images of one object. These different images can each have, can each work through a different aspect of likeness. So one can compare, for example, a fairly photorealistic painting with a caricature. On the other hand, there can also be one image of an indefinite number of objects. Here, Jonas used the example of an illustration in a botanical textbook. The illustration of a pine tree, for example, depicts the pine tree as such. It depicts an indefinite number of pine trees. Now, this particular bit is a bit unclear. I don't know, maybe something we'll mention in the discussion. I think it's definitely odd to say that the illustration of a pine tree depicts an indefinite number of pine trees. In the same way, the two different paintings of the same person depict that person. I think this bit here with the indefinite number of objects is maybe a tiny bit unclear, but okay, regardless. Moving on. Then Jonas, after discussing the image, moves on to the image maker and the image beholder, man, of course. What are the properties of a creature that can create and behold images? Firstly, these two aspects of the relationship to the image, so the ability to make images and the ability to behold images, are essentially equivalent. Any creature that is capable of one is going to also be capable of the other. The basic condition of both of these is the perception of likeness as likeness. Now, this is something that is unique to man. With animals, animals can perceive either sameness or otherness. I think the example he uses is a scarecrow. So a scarecrow will either be perceived as a human, a man, by a bird, and in that case, the bird will be afraid of it, or it will not be perceived as a man. So there's no, it will not, the scarecrow will never be perceived as something that is supposed to look like a man. That is the point here. Likeness as such is never perceived by animals, only sameness or otherness. Likeness as such is something that is only perceived by man. Hence, the image is not a function of the perceptual degree of likeness. So there's no statistical way of describing the likeness that would be necessary for something to be the image of something else, but rather a conceptual dimension of its own within which degrees of likeness can occur. So there's an indefinite number of ways that an image can resemble the object it represents. Again, something like a caricature is a really good example, because caricatures can often be very parsimonious in the number of features that they portray. They can be very, very simple and nevertheless very recognizable. So the real object of the image here as Jonas puts it, is the eidos as such, which means that the capacity to make and or behold images requires the mental separation of form from matter. It requires something that then, of course, plays a very important role in theoretical knowledge as well. So here, another relatively short quote. When it comes to this separation of form from matter and how it relates to perception, here Jonas talks about a very interesting paradox, which ties into some other topics we've discussed, going back all the way to the first essay. Quote, the felt effectiveness of its data, which is necessary for the experience of the reality of the real, as this is attested in the reality of my effectiveness, must in part be cancelled out again in order to permit the apprehension of its objectivity. The element of encounter is balanced by one of abstraction, without which sensation would not rise to perception. First, in a somewhat stretched sense of the term, there is abstraction from the state of sensory stimulation itself in the very fact of one's perceiving the object instead of his own organic affection. Second, and in a more accepted sense, perception continuously abstracts from the immediate sensory content of affection in allowing the object its identity beyond the change of its views. We see not once this, once that complex of data, but through both the same thing, abstracting, as it were, from the differences of successive sensations or from the sense material. This visual abstraction makes possible what Kant has called the synthesis of recognition. So this abstraction, with its two moments, is most clearly seen, is most conspicuous precisely in vision. Here, not to go into vision too much, because this is not the right essay to do that, but here he develops a very interesting aspect of this. So he discusses the fact that the seemingly simple fact that we see objects as being the same through time, as having some kind of a diachronic identity, and also the fact that this seems to be something that is part of perception itself. We perceive the object as identical. We don't come to that conclusion through some kind of reasoning. And if this is so, then we perceive the object through a set of different temporal phases, each of which is a possible image of the object itself. The object itself isn't any of those temporal phases, and yet it can be represented by any of them. Any of those is, in a sense, the object, but the object isn't any of those. So what this means, what the fact that we have object permanence means, is that, at least to some degree, abstraction, representation, and symbolism, so the very characteristics of the image function, must already be implicated in seeing itself, in perception. And interestingly, he says that this is present in degrees, even in higher animals. So not just in man, which again, if we keep in mind that this is just talking about object permanence, does not seem to be a too radical thesis. Now, the specific difference of man is that there is a kind of a stepping back of the second order, as he puts it, the free possession of appearance qua appearance. Man can understand, man can completely abstract the eidos from the matter in which it is seen, unlike animals. And that's also the difference between human memory and animal recollection. With human memory, the appearance, the sensory, that's precisely the point, not exactly the sensory impression itself, but rather precisely the eidos of what happened, what was seen in the past, is manipulated at will by man. and it can be compared, contrasted, manipulated, whatever. And that is precisely what differentiates human memory from animal recollection. Of course, Jonas is not the only author. I don't remember right now who was the first to talk about this among German philosophers, but we'll get to that in the discussion. Okay. So leaving that aside for a moment, the image is thus a form of externalized memory, precisely insofar as it relies on the eidos, on the appearance as such, and on likeness as such. And then Jonas connects this with the notion of truth, with the experience of truth, theoretical truth. Here, he says that the relationship between the image and the thing that is depicted is the root, as it were, of theoretical truth. So the adequatio imaginis ad rem, the adequation of the image to the thing, is the root of the adequation of the intellect to the thing, which is, of course, the sort of classical definition of truth. And this is something that we will return to in the appendix very soon. Before that point, just a couple of different additional things that Jonas points out that seem interesting here. First of all, he introduces the notion of eidetic control of motility. So the man's capacity to deal with appearances as such, to perceive likeness as such, isn't something that is exclusively mental. It is also enacted in a way. It is also embodied. The eidetic control of imagination requires and implies also the eidetic control of motility of the body, the capacity to paint, to depict something. A short quote here, expressing both in one indivisible evidence. Homo pictor represents the point in which Homo faber and Homo sapiens are conjoined, are indeed shown to be one and the same. Once again, the point on depicting and viewing images being inseparable. And finally, the perception of likeness, while it is not a rational faculty, at least, well, depending on how one understands rationality, but it is certainly not a discursive faculty, but it nevertheless demands at least potential reason. Another quote, which I think is probably the final one of the last sentences of the essay before we get into the appendix. For the gap between animal world relation and the crudest attempt at representation is infinitely wider than that between the latter and any geometrical construction. It is a metaphysical gap, compared with which the other is only one of degree. So once again, the complexity of the image, whether it is a childish depiction of something, or an extremely complex geometrical construction, that is not what matters here. The capacity of representation is the key metaphysical difference between the animal world relation and the human capacity of representation and of imaging. Okay, so now we are getting into the appendix, fairly short but very interesting appendix on the origins of the experience of truth. Here he ties it up with, of course, the preceding discussion on the image and what truth has to do with the image. So the original locus of falsehood, of truth, even though, of course, he highlights, I think, at the very beginning that image making has something to do with truth, because, of course, as he puts it already in the essay itself, the adequatio imaginis ad rem, so the adequation of the image to the thing being the origin of truth, the image is a a great example of the active effort to attain truth, but the seed of the experience of falsehood and truth is before that. It is in perception itself. This is another aspect in which the image and perception are very much inextricably intertwined in this essay. So the original locus of truth has to be already in perception. And here, truth, as he puts it in a very uncharacteristically Heideggerian way, has the character of undeceiving oneself, the character of seeing through delusions, seeing through falsehood. And when he talks about how this works, I don't know if he uses this example, but so falsehood and the distinction between truth and falsehood is something that is exclusive to man, in that the wrong perception survives to be confronted as falsified with the right one. So what does this mean? In man, if we see something as false, that does not mean that we have simply rectified an error, which animals are perfectly capable of, but rather we can still keep the false perception, we can still keep the illusion, and confront it with the actual perception, with the correct perception, and see it as falsified. Whereas in the case of a simple rectification of an error, which happens in animals, the wrong impression is simply no more. It is replaced by the correct one, and that's it. It disappears. So with man, this distinction between truth and falsehood requires, on the one hand, a detachment of appearance from reality, and on the other hand, of course, memory, which is connected with the detachment of appearance from reality. It requires this precisely insofar as it requires man to keep the false image present, to compare it with the correct one. And this talk of truth and falsehood might lead one to believe that perception would have to entail judgment one way or another, because after all, we are talking about truth and falsehood being inherent in perception itself. So it seems easy to suppose here that perception must already contain judgments, or maybe even consistent judgments in a way. But this is something that Jonas criticizes here, rejects pretty much right out of the gate. He offers two interesting objections to the view that perception could be a kind of judgment. The first one, fairly obvious one, is that perception is something that obviously also happens with animals, and it seems extremely odd to suppose that animals are constantly making judgments about what they perceive. So that doesn't seem to make sense. But that's not the only reason why perception cannot be a kind of judgment. To quote here, "But apart from the semantic disadvantage of thus attenuating the meaning of a term," so watering down the notion of judgment, which is related to the watering down of consciousness that we discussed in one of our previous meetings. So apart from this, the idea of a perceiving which does not in the very act relate the present content to a wider range of experience is a mere abstraction. To perceive is to admit the sense content into a total of experience in which it exhibits such cognitive qualities as known, familiar, vaguely familiar, puzzling, startling. Even the experience of absolute novelty, which leaves the percipient entirely at a loss as to what he is perceiving, is possible only with reference to the accustomed wherein he is perceptually at home. Thus, perception as such, as it constitutes itself in each instance on the background of past experience, also points forward to future validation or invalidation. This is a I've completely lost count of what time it is, of how many times I've said this, but this is a very Merleau-Pontian point here. Maybe too many times, but regardless, this time I think it really bears saying. It is a very Merleau-Pontian point. Perceiving entails integrating what is perceived into a total of experience. There is no perceiving without that. But okay, we'll probably get to that in the discussion as well. Now, to conclude, I said previously that Jonas was uncharacteristically Heideggerian in the way he talked about in the way he introduced the concept of truth and falsehood. But of course, he also has to balance that out by taking a jab at Heidegger right at the end of this appendix, and he does that rather harshly. So he highlights that the present discussion of truth in the appendix has to do only with theoretical and not moral truth. Moral truth is something else, and he doesn't discuss it explicitly, of course, in this essay, but he does point out that moral truth is the first meaning of aletheis in Greek, which is very much counter to Heidegger's interpretation. So Heidegger's interpretation of the word aletheia, or aletheis as the adjective meaning true, is something that became kind of a how to put it? It became pretty much very well known, and especially in the Heideggerian current of phenomenology, it became gospel. And Heidegger understands aletheia etymologically, with the a being the alpha privativum, so the negation, and lethe, meaning the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, forgetting, concealing. So aletheia would then be unconcealing, the non-concealment of things, of being. So yeah, essentially that's Heidegger's interpretation of aletheia in a nutshell. And Jonas claims that this interpretation isn't really justified, that in ancient Greek, originally, aletheis was first used as meaning someone that is honest and someone that is truthful in a moral sense. And also the verb, aletheoin, does not mean to unconceal the way Heidegger would have it. In fact, it isn't even transitive originally. The verb cannot be used transitively to unconceal something. That use is impossible. But rather, it is an intransitive verb, which means to abstain from concealing, i.e., to abstain from concealing things in relation to our fellow human beings. So again, to be honest and truthful. So Jonas concludes this appendix with a interesting stab at Heidegger's interesting etymology. Now, of course, Heidegger had more than his fair share of etymologies, which might not be philologically completely justified. So one can see why this kind of a criticism would be justified. But yeah, in any case, this sort of balances out the strangely Heideggerian definition of truth that Jonas himself used earlier on. So, okay, I think with that will be it for the presentation, and we can get into the discussion. Okay, since I'm also the host now, I also have to say, I don't know, thank me for the presentation. So does anyone have any, would I like to point out any questions, or yeah, Does anyone have any questions, comments on any of these topics?
I mean, maybe the first question that came to my mind is, what were the main takeaways for you while summarizing this chapter?
I mean, in a way, it's the chapter fits fairly neatly with the rest of the book, in the sense that I didn't feel that there was any kind of a discontinuity here. And I have to say, to me, this chapter is one of the more straightforward ones, in the sense that there aren't um, that many places which seem very odd. So in previous chapters, we often discussed certain paragraphs that really seem to sound extremely naturalistic, for example, or whatever, that sort of seem to really not fit in with the rest of the book. Here, I didn't really, I don't know, I didn't really see anything like that. And I don't know if I would say that anything is extremely surprising in that sense. But I suppose the whole approach of taking images as the thing that is most characteristic of man would be sort of the main takeaway and the most fascinating aspect of this.
And then while giving the presentation, you made a note, right? That it's there was one strange paragraph there where he says that every image represents the indefinite amount of all of that type. Yeah, I also thought that was a bit strange when he said that. Maybe we can just get that out of the way to begin the discussion. Like when he said that the caveman who draws the bison is not drawing any particular bison, but representing all of them. I just thought, like, how can we possibly know that? Maybe the caveman was drawing some particular encounter with the bison and not representing the eidos of bison as such. So I also thought that was a bit of an odd statement, but for the rest, I think I agree with your
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start, because it definitely is one of the places that I mean, as you pointed it out, and apart from that, he talks about the imaging function and the relationship of image to imaged object. He seems to talk about it in the same way, regardless of whether it's the portrait of a particular person or a botanical illustration. Now, I did have an issue with the both of these being completely legitimate types of image, but there has to be some kind of a difference here between the portrait of a particular person, which resembles one specific face, and an illustration of a pine tree, which is supposed to depict pine trees as such. Now, of course, in both cases, we are dealing with some kind of an ADOS, but this ADOS has to be, I don't know, in some way or other, it has to be different, of a different order.
Yeah. And I would also say that there's something in between the two. Like I have here a cup, a teacup with 3 cats on it. I don't know if you can see them. So I would say this isn't depicting cats as such, and also not any particular cats, but a certain configuration of cats with this color and this background. So like it's somewhere in the gray zone between the two extremes of particular cat and general cat.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, go ahead, Ella.
This discussion just reminds me of a book by Lorraine Daston and another author, which is titled Objectivity, and where she talks about how different ways of seeing were like developed in science, with a focus on atlas making. So atlases as like scientific representations of a special science knowledge, right? So it tries to be like a complete guide to what is known at a certain point of time. And she has like three specific, they describe like three epistemic virtues of how these images were produced. And one is, I think, truth to nature. And I think it's precisely, she talks about the botanical images. And there's just this discussion between were they depicting a particular pine tree, or was it meant to be like a generalizable thing? And how actually this changed from maybe a more particular representation image, and later on became, so then one of the phases is also like trained judgment, which was basically, so the image of, for instance, brain pathologies or like tissue pathologies was not meant to represent, to mirror the what was a slice of brain, what was seen, but it was supposed to like emphasize things that a doctor in training should notice, right? So like that there are like you can trace different sorts of epistemic virtues guiding the production of scientific images, and that different historical timeframes had different virtue of what was important to be depicted in an atlas image.
Isn't this precisely just one of the reasons why you would want to introduce something like an image into the discussion and basically differentiate it between, say, something that would be completely particularized and just something that would be utterly individualistic, and something that would be on the level of the concept in the sense of being utterly general and formal, with image basically having these two elements where you always have an approach to a certain generality through a certain particularity, and it's basically ineradicable from the image. And this basically means that there will be always an element of your own intention and your own specific slant on things, and also the anchoring out of which it emerged. So for example, it might very well be that the hunter was depicting a certain animal that he saw, but at the same time he was doing more that he might, if pressed, be thinking that he was doing, if that was even like a possibility. It's a very hypothetical question about these early hunters. So yeah, sure, he was depicting a bison of a very particular, from a very particular encounter, but at the same time it was more than that. So it had a certain generality that was above it, but it was not completely devoid of, say, a certain materiality of sorts. And also I think that's also one of the reasons why, for example, images can be interesting, because what seems to be, in a certain sense, a contingent element, for example, the materiality in which you represent a certain image, can actually start playing a role to the degree where it basically determines the way how certain things will start to develop. So what I mean by that, for example, you can depict a certain image in different materialities, and then it might seem just a very pragmatic thing, but if you start depicting them, for example, in the digital media, they acquire novel meanings precisely because they have this, particular element to them. So unlike, for example, the concept, which basically truly tries to just aspire towards generality, it has this element of, let's say, particularity or a certain aspectivity to it. And I think that was one of the motivations for Jonas for introducing the realm of the image. So how do you get something that would be neither here nor there?
I mean, can you even depict anything without some sort of generality? Because even as the caveman was trying to depict bison, he wouldn't really be able to depict him like in the same way. He would always be simplifying, trying to find general forms which would represent that bison. So I think there's this constant interconnection between the particular and the general. And isn't this actually the Aristotelian notion of what art is? It is trying to represent the general in the particular. And I think the very act of creation, the very act of depiction of image making kind of forces you to be general about the particular.
Yeah, I think that ties into what Jonas says about the perception of likeness. So even if the hunter was trying to depict a particular bison, nevertheless, if he is to be a creature that is capable of depicting something, he has to be able to see the bison as a bison, as potentially any bison. So that's where the generality comes in. Another thing I just like to mention, so when we're talking about scientific illustrations, I think that really does a good job of highlighting the specific and historically, culturally determined nature of specific images. So I'm thinking here of Flick and his analysis of science, which is a very sort of radical approach. But regardless of what one may think of it, he has a when he talks about it, I don't know what paper that is. Maybe Sebastian, you will remember when he talks about certain, I think it's certain pathological findings from syphilis, but basically stuff that someone can see under a microscope. And when he talks about the different ways that pathologists would describe that to their students, and how an untrained person, when looking at that through the microscope, would simply not see anything. It would be just a sort of jumbled mass of things. And it takes a lot of training to be able to see something that can then be depicted. Now, that's, of course, true for anatomy in general, because the human body is a great deal less neat and orderly than is any anatomical representation. There's a reason why it took so long for those anatomical representations, the way we know them today, to be developed. And there's also a reason why they're very limited in what they depict. So, yeah, there's an interesting aspect in which images, especially here when we're talking about scientific illustrations of something, aren't with an image of a bison, there's not much of a problem here. It's fairly simple. But with the image of I don't know, of what a specific tumor type looks like under a microscope, then we get into more problematic territory, because it's not at all clear. First of all, no one will see the things that they need to see, the things that are depicted in the image, without a lot of training, learning to see them, and just how a musician will learn what it means for something to be out of tune. Like if anyone had the experience of learning to tune an instrument by ear, it's not something that's immediately obvious. Once one gets the sort of the necessary, how to put it, the grip on it, it becomes completely obvious. And of course, like it's obvious when you compare the two tones, it's obvious what you need to do. But if you tell that to an untrained person, you have to get there through a series of steps to sort of hear the discordances and whatnot. So yeah, this whole issue of images which require a great deal of training to be able to even see.
I think that's a great point, because there's this idea when you're trying to learn to art, you often get advice that you shouldn't try to draw things the way you think they should be. So, for example, circles for heads, triangles for other things, but you should learn to see them. And there's a lot of this process of just learning to even depict things. And when you're doing this learning, you're not really operating independently, but are embedded in a cultural context, which is also influencing how you're going to depict, how you're going to make images.
I just wanted to say regarding like scientific looking, that obviously there's a lot of training involved, but not only training as in like distinction between what is relevant and what is not, but also like a specific application of concepts, right? So when you see this is the example of like Brandon with that like, so you have this gas chamber where an electron goes by, and there's like a this is an old experiment, so they don't use that anymore, but you can see like a stretch, right? And it's not you don't only see the stretch. Like if you're a physicist who maybe if I would see it, I would see just a stretch, and I would then like be told, okay, this is an electron. But a physicist sees it differently than a mere like trace, because he has inferential conceptual knowledge of what it means to be an electron. So in a way, his perception is conceptually structured not only because like he can see what is relevant, or this may be more relevant in biology, but also because he knows how the thing that he sees functions in inferential knowledge relations.
I had a question in the chapter that I thought that it was a minor question, but might be related to what you were saying. At some point, I think it's on a footnote, he makes a distinction between the representative function and the expressive function. And I think you are, Ella, emphasizing what he's calling a representative function. But reading, I had this question, how to make the distinction between what is representative and what is expressive? Because he uses as an example of expression the brushwork that we can see, for example, in Van Gogh. It is there, and it carries the mark of the causality of the production, but is symbolic too. And I was wondering how to not make the distinction between representative and expressive function, but where to draw the line. In this case, for example, that you are describing, it seems like the representative function is more important than the expressive one. But I had this question reading the chapter.
We can maybe read this part. Footnotes.
Yeah, maybe I don't remember this.
Okay, I'll read it. Or maybe Adnan, you have this nice British accent, so maybe you can do it.
I just found it. So yeah, that's footnote number 4.
164.
Okay.
Page.
So this is a footnote to first sentence to which it is a footnote. He says that the image does not represent the causality of its own becoming, and then the footnote. It may, though, betray this causality in its visible technique, the stroke of the brush, the marks of the chisel, as a handwriting may betray the motor performance of the writer. And in both cases, this effect can become intentional, that is, co-intended with the representational intention. In that case, the image is charged with an expressive function superimposed on the representational one, which is to say that it is more than image. The image function by itself is strictly objective, and as long as it is kept pure, the self-expression of the maker, which inevitably finds its way into it, remains unintentional and consequently unobtrusive, noticeable, if at all, to trained attention only. In subjectivist stages of civilization, the maker's self-expression may become a goal and conspicuous by choice, as in the brushwork of Baroque painters or of Van Gogh. And with this shift from the representational to the expressive, the very role of image changes.
I think, like from what I understood, this would be different to what I was saying specifically, because here it's a reversal, so that you already have this eidos of an image, right? And then like the sort of like the substratum doesn't matter, but as Vorosh before says of the digital, it can become like part of the meaning of the image, right? So the material substratum, or like the brush stroke, can superimpose upon the, I don't know, depiction of Van Gogh depicts a starry night. So it's a depiction of a starry night, but it also becomes a depiction of Van Gogh's starry night, right? So it bears them, it has this meaning of the author superimposed on it through the substrate itself, or the way it was made. So that's how I understood this. And maybe I just want to like make a short like line between what I was saying before and a question that I have. So in the appendix, in the quote that you read, Adnan, so this criticism of judgment and not being really present in perception. I was wondering specifically about the second objectification, like criticism. Like, why does it prevent? So this talk of like a percept always having to be in reference to a totality of experience, of experiences and predictions of experience and whatnot. Why does this by itself like negate the presence, or like that the perception is a judgment in a way?
If I understand him correctly, I think he would say that it is precisely because the thing is precisely seen as being in the context of everything. So this sort of integration into the total whole of experience is something that cannot be. It's impossible for there to be perception without that. And if it is impossible for there to be perception without that, then that can't be some kind of a judgment, which would be in addition to perception, but rather has to be a part of perception. Now, of course, we can define judgment as something. We can define judgment more loosely, so that it's sort of already there. But then again, back to the discussion on how loose can we make terms before we
okay,
start.
but what?
No, but this
What
is
is the definition of judgment in this case? Like, what is the definition of judgment that he wants to keep out of perception?
So before we continue here, I would just like to add something with regards to this. So what he's explicitly referring to here, and what he's trying to align himself with, is this general backlash that happened in psychology and philosophy against these overtly, let's say, intellectualist conceptions of perception, which happened with Gestalt psychology and early phenomenology. And the basic idea was that you can have meaningful wholes without having to have implicit judgments present, which was something that was a Cartesian heritage. And it seemed to have led to a lot of, first of all, conceptual confusions, theoretical confusions, because if you have a judgment, this presupposes that you basically have to have something that is a meaningless non-given, which judgment then brings together and forms somehow, which has a lot of issues in and of itself. But it was also problematic with regards to some of the studies that have been done, especially in the Gestalt psychology tradition, and they were very, very vocal about this. So, for example, Köhler, Koshka and others, they were kind of very, very critical of this, and they were doing a lot of experiments where they would show that perception has a certain holistic character to it, where it forms certain morphological wholes without the inclusion of judgment. Now, I don't know what Brandon means by that. I think that he's kind of using something with regards to, like you said, certain capacities to draw inferences and whatnot. I don't know how this fits into the problem. This is the problem when you have different traditions talking different languages and then trying to get them together. but they would ultimately, Jonas included, and for example, the previously mentioned Merleau-Ponty and the Gestalt tradition, they would argue that perception itself has a certain structure where you have these wholes without necessarily having to have a judgment present.
Then I would ask, like we talked about, so the Boyle article about additive and transformative views of rationality, right? So and if we like would be trying to how to say, if we would want to agree that like human perception is radically transformed by rationality, so rationality is not only something that rests on top of it, but is always already present in perception, how to like tease apart, or is it possible even to tease apart, these sort of gestalt structures, holistic structures of perception from holistic structures in a way also of judgment making? So
This
since
is a good
this
question.
is not a,
Yeah, this is a really good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, but this is also something that's been kind of in a certain sense bugging me. And I think that like getting a proper understanding of these notions of what you mean, for example, by an image and what you mean by, say, a concept and then a judgment, like this is a prerequisite for having this type of answer. And yeah, I mean, it's a very very interesting question, because ultimately once you become an uncultured, linguistic, properly symbolic being, let's say, then it really is dubious to what degree you can truly separate this aspect of yourself from even the simplest perception, without, aside from very, very specific contexts, which are atypical and which put you in a position that is, let's say, a suboptimal or something like that, and then but that is not really characteristic of this. So yeah, that's a really good question.
I mean, one also answer that is kind of giving itself to me is, so Jonas talks about object permanence, right? And that we can assume, or probably even like some empirical studies try to show that even animals have, sense of object permanency. And that is like a, right, so a whole, or like a sort of a perceptual structure that like we can say that there is not like a discursive judgment present, because it's like in higher animals, but nonetheless it points to there being a structure, right? And also, yeah, just maybe a short comment that I think, so this sort of enactivism or like sensory body, probably Merleau-Pontian version of bringing the body back into like the thing that generalizes in a way like the object, right? So because the object is something that can be manipulated with in I don't know, a coffee cup with my hand, that's why I know it's like when I change it, I know that it's going to be the same coffee cup, not because I know it's a coffee cup in this conceptual way. So at least in that way, I think you can tease apart a bit that there are certain perceptual structures like that are connected with like your experiences of interacting with an object, and that sort of structure is also present in non-discursive animals.
Yeah, true. But now this is what I'm thinking. So you have these capacities as a, say, a human being or a human embodied being, which opens up a specific way of engaging with the world, with this, which is quite atypical. And which carries this capacity to enter into the realm of the possible. But then, you know, this is just the opening that you have, and then you kind of aspire to cultivate it. But the way that you're going to cultivate it is precisely by, in a certain sense, being the rational being in a broader sense than just, you know, like a very necessarily operationalized rationality, but just like being the minded being, which is the being which is able to establish contexts, transform contexts, you know, move within contexts and all of that. And, you know, once this happens, then basically this feeds backwards into everything. So you basically have this capacity as an opening, but it doesn't necessarily have to reach the fruition. But if it does, it basically permeates everything. So a very telling example for me are these feral children, you know, I actually read 2 books where they're like very well, the most famous cases are as thoroughly as possibly documented. There's always an issue there, and it's just fascinating to see to what degree if you miss on these if you miss cashing in on these specific time slots that allow you to achieve certain transformations, how basically you cannot go back, and how profoundly different the end result is. So you have a human form, but at the same time, or perhaps you shouldn't even put it like that, because you have a human body, but there is no human form. This is the eerie part. So everyone who was engaged with feral children, they always said like there was a certain air about them, which was just kind of slightly creepy in a way. You know, not necessarily that they were not likable or what have you, far from it, but there was just, you know, something about them. And of course, you know, this can go in different directions on how you're going to interpret it, but I think that in my opinion, it has something profoundly to do with what we're talking about now. So there was this opening that never reached the fruition, and then there was no feedback loop backwards where you would have this, something that basically in many sense it is pretty much taken for granted.
Wait,
with
so
everyone.
This makes me wonder if rationality, if you with this example of the feral children, if the human body by itself doesn't grow into a rational being, and if growing into this human form of rationality requires socialization and enculturing, does it mean then that what we call rationality is in a sense a tradition that is passed on, that it's carried through tradition and not through the biology by itself?
Well, I would say yes, that to a degree.
I would say that rationality is a social like achievement, and it is it's basically handed down through language, and not only through language but through other like images and whatnot, symbols.
It's a social institution of sorts.
Okay, but now the interesting question, of course, is raised. What does that particularly mean? So I'm going to intentionally bring up two questions. So the fact that it is a socio-cultural tradition, does it mean that it is completely contingent and relative? And secondly, can there be better or worse socio-cultural context and conditions, or is this an inappropriate category? So radical contingency, does this mean, so the fact that it is a tradition, does it mean that it is relative and contingent? And second, does it mean that you can have better socio-cultural contexts which allow for the cultivation of this ability or opening in a way that is more conducive than certain others?
I would say to the second question, yes, but it depends on like, what do you mean by better? And but sure, I mean, okay, maybe you can rephrase again the second question, but
maybe we start with the first one. It's easier. No, it's not easier. It's like also very difficult, but I think they are closely related. So if you have a certain view on the first one, I think it translates into how you're going to position yourself.
I was to another lecture this week that said, like, so it interpreted like idealism and materialism, not in this way, maybe but when we're talking about now, but like idealism as in mind being completely, like, self-contained. Okay, yeah. And materialism as in mind being at least partially determined by like materiality and vice versa. And so the question would be, of this contingency, are material phenomena of society contingent? And then we go into this whole tradition, which would say no, because they have been conceptualizing this sort of, or no, like there is some sort of, a direction, but of the material, and thus also of the mental. But I don't know, that's like a whole other venue of philosophy that deals with that, and I haven't read enough of that to like give an answer.
Yeah, so how does one go about doing this?
Well, I would maybe start by saying that to the first question of, okay, if rationality is a social cultural tradition, is it wholly contingent and relative? I would say that it has to have some generality, some degree of generality, if having this conversation makes any sense at all, right? Otherwise we are just expressing contingent human behaviors that have no reason, and then there is no reason in it, actually. So I would think there has to be some generality to it, some way in which it opens onto a field, something more universal than just the contingent, which is also linked, I guess, to the paper, where this abstracting faculty, where we can separate the eidos and consider that. I think there's a link there. So at least to the first question, I would say it's not fully relative. It achieves some level of generality.
And also I think you can, like, pure contingency would be in a way like really random, right? But I think it would be kind of make sense to talk about like that, like the next step was determined by like the historical context right before it, right? So that's, I guess, the point of like genealogy and whatnot, that you can like trace like this sort of ideas transforming, like with going through history and like checking discursive practices, but not only discursive practices, but like material practices and whatnot. So I think it's not contingent, at least in this sense, that it would go like it, that it wouldn't have some sort of, I don't know, like road structure, or I don't know how to say it, direction.
Would it be fair to say that, for example, one way of thinking about these generalities is by, in some very fundamental way, in tying them to precisely these, let's say, very fundamental existential rhythms, and then, like you said, with regards to very specific materialities in which you find yourself, they take on certain movements of their own. So let me give you like a very simple example what I mean, and it's not going to touch upon rationality directly, but it kind of offers a segue maybe into it. So for example, you know, as a human being, in order to survive, you have to breathe, which requires a certain rhythm. You have to eat and drink and sleep, and you have to have shelter. And these are like very, very specific things that are deeply, deeply fundamental to your existence. However, the way you're going to go about doing this is going to introduce a very specific and subtle spin to the trajectory, to the genealogy. It will start a very specific genealogy, and it will introduce a certain element, I wouldn't say of contingency, but of particularity. And I still remember, you know, reading, what was it, this French historian, Brodel, I think. He was, he had I was extremely fascinated by the way he went about doing histories, because he was kind of talking about history as a layered structure. So you have a very slow moving parts of history which barely change at all, and then you have these fast pacing changes. So the fast pacing ones would be, you know, at one point the beards are very popular, and then 20 years later nobody is wearing any beards, and then the hats are popular, and then they are no longer popular. So something that is like very, very quickly changing. And then the slow changing rhythms are the rhythms that have to do with geography and stuff like that. So like these very, very subtle, slow rhythms, which are extremely important, but you forget about them. And he compares, for example, the way that the very fundamental or the foundational nutrient in China and in Europe were produced, and the conditions under which they were grown. So rice and wheat, and you know, you can harvest rice 2 to 3 times per year, whereas wheat you can only do it once, and it was way more fickle with regards to many other things. And it was just fascinating how he kind of was able to show how these fundamental cycles of just, you know, having to produce your main foodstuff every year influenced how many other things developed around it. So, you know, what it meant for people, how much free time they had, because, you know, how much time you had to spend toiling the fields, and, you know, how much reliable this was, and what it meant for future generations, how many, for example, years of famine you had on average, and how this fed into the structure of the villages and the cities and whatnot. And this is just one factor, and he goes through a lot of them. So all this to say is, you know, everybody eats, but we do it in a very specific way. And this very specific way may start off, in a certain sense, relatively contingently, but then this materiality acquires a movement of its own. And this I find interesting in a certain sense.
I would like relate it. So, I mean, you mentioned like geographical materiality influencing it, right? And again, no expert here, but like this Marxian takes would be that the economical level, so the production of.
He also covers that. So I just use this one example.
Okay.
So just as a one like very, very fundamental rhythm, which is related to the weather and to the climate and to the conditions, and then just how it's something that is there and it really feeds into many things. For example, the structure of your houses and the structure of the inhabitation. So
but what is interesting precisely in the time we live now, so in the time of globalism, that these particularities of like geography are being transcended through global capitalism, where you have, where I can eat Chinese or like, what not food from other continents wherever I go to a store, I go into the city, and I can get it. And that's not, I mean, it's interesting in this way that you can see the material part of it also spreading around the world and transforming. So what's like, so this materiality of the economy is now ever present, right? present all over the world almost. And so this is also again tied to this sort of no alternative view, because, you know, capitalism and whatnot is so omnipresent that it's hard to think outside of it.
Pretty much wanted to say something.
Even if we go before that, is rationality really something this heterogeneous that it would justify saying that it's this relative to all these variables? And can it really be this relative? I'm not sure about that.
So this is something that I was thinking about, and to a certain degree, I do have the feeling that there is a bit of a back and forth between how you understand rationality and what normative structure becomes ingrained in a certain culture at a certain point, and it is related to these types of conditions. Now, I personally wouldn't go down the full-blown Marxist route. I think that there's a lot of merit to it. I think that it brought to the foreground a lot of interesting factors. It can also become extremely reductive in many ways, and this is like the main reason why I don't really find it particularly useful for some phenomena. But for instance, you know, if you read people like Plotinus or the Neoplatonists and the way they talk about nous, yeah, the way they understood mindedness, and then later in the Middle Ages, for example, you read not necessarily Meister Eckhart, but maybe also, you know, other thinkers of that period. Again, the way they understand intellectus is very much different. And then at some point, you know, especially 18th, 19th century, with the development of technology and with a very specific conception of how machines work and how the idea of machines can be related to certain other segments, you know, to the culture, to the society, to the human psyche, the reasoning itself starts becoming very, very specifically understood, yeah, as almost like an algorithmic thinking. And, you know, now you have like a backlash against this. So this is why, for me, this is such an interesting question. You know, what is it, in a certain sense, that you are talking about when you're talking about rationality? And sometimes I have an issue with this idea that, you know, the Western culture was logocentric. Well, yeah, but you're pissed off about a certain conception of rationality that's been present for the past 100 and 200 years, and now, you know, you're kind of doing an unfair equivocation between this and what was previously called the logos. But just before, because you had like this idea of logos, it was a very different logos, you know. And if you read things like Plotinus, it's a very different conception to the point that, you know, for someone who is not familiar with the overall background, it won't really make that much sense. So that's why I find this particular question interesting. And this is just within the so-called Western tradition. Now, you know, if we spread this out to at least two more centers where you had like this very, very vibrant, let's say, rational cultures of a specific type develop, say India and China, and all of them started with a different spin. And it impacted, you know, how the specific cultures that were called philosophical, for instance, developed. So I don't know. It's an interesting question, I think.
But if we try to find this generality which underpins rationality, like Atul said earlier on, what I wonder is, if we find this, wouldn't it determine rationality to a great degree? How it's going to develop? Because I think that's what the question of how relative rationality is hinges upon. If this basic underpinning is actually this determining, then I think it might not be as relative as we might like to think. It might not be as socioculturally specific. It might have specific sociocultural contents, but the basic form would be relative to, I don't know, the structure of human consciousness, whatever. Or for example, if we go back to Jonas, with the capacity for image making. And if it is dependent on the capacity for image making, it's going to be dependent on a pretty specific kind of activity. And if it is dependent on this way, how relative or how is it really still free in a certain sense to just come up with all these different kinds of rationalities, or are they in the end linked to a very similar framework and determined in this way?
Yeah, this is yeah, go on.
I mean, I just wanted to say that, like, when you talk about the structure of consciousness and about this capacity for, what did you say, capacity for images,
Yeah.
it's also, isn't that also like explainable only through sociality? So, or would you like somehow historically have it be present in human as such, you know?
But Ella, there are two levels here, and one has to be careful with regards to this. One is to say that in order for a certain something to come to be, to develop, it requires a social context or a cultural context. But this can be a general claim. So for instance, you might say that image making requires sociality. Good. But it's a different claim than saying that you require that it is dependent on a specific social context, so that it can appear only in a specific social context. I might say it is dependent on social context in general, or I might say it is dependent sheerly or merely on social context. So then you would have this. You would say image making is a general trait which is dependent on the social context. But you might have different manifestations of image making, which is dependent on different social contexts. So then you have a different ball game, eh?
I'd like to just add one thing. When you mentioned the idea of nous, intellectus, in Neoplatonism. Now, the idea of nous or of logos, and indeed probably the most famous instance of the word logos being in the opening line of the Gospel of John, that is something that's not that is something that strikes us as odd when we're reading Plotinus, for example. But I would say that it can definitely be argued that it's not unique to late antiquity, for example. One can find it in very, very different cultures. So, of course, I don't know, the Islamic Middle Ages, no surprises there, because that's essentially just takes up the whole Neoplatonist framework. And then, I don't know, China, India, and one could make a different claim. One could say that this notion of there being some kind of a supra-individual nous or intellectus, or sort of the ultimate, how to put it, that which understands the deepest things that man can understand, that aspect of mind being supra-individual, one could say that that is sort of fairly universal. We find it across cultures. And one can say that the modern view, whereby intellectuality is completely isolated, completely individualized, and completely subordinated to a kind of algorithmic calculating thinking, to use Heidegger's phrase, one could say that that view is, to use Guénon's favorite phrase, a modern deviation. That is, that's the thing that we should understand. Why did that happen? Not why did this thing with the logos and the nous, why did that happen? But why did these things change in such a way in modernity? And of course, technology, machines, that's one important aspect of it. That moment also coincides with, I don't know, universal education, abandonment of religion, plenty of things that change there, and the democratization of knowledge, essentially, which, of course, which many authors don't necessarily see as a pure and simple blessing, to put it mildly.
Ella.
But sorry.
I just wanted to make a short, like, just note. Sorry. Oh my God.
No, but the reason I saw Lela, you were constantly holding your finger up. So Leila, you also wanted to say something?
Yeah, just briefly, but go
okay,
ahead,
then,
Ella.
Ella and then
No
Lee.
problem.
Lee.
Like,
Okay.
I just this comment that it's like you can conceptualize, right? These two rivers of philosophy, like so philosophy of continuity and philosophy of discontinuity, and I mean that's also I guess a relevant distinction for what we're talking about. Whereas does, I don't know, rationality or like any other kind of human systems go like continuously and like go improve themselves, or do you have radical epistemic breaks and then like things rearrange themselves, or like paradigm shifts or whatnot? So right, you have many authors conceptualizing this sort of discontinuity that is essential to the development of human societies and rationality and whatnot. And as far as like these different conceptions of rationality from Platonius, I think said, but I think Foucault writes a lot about different conceptualizations of the self, right? And how the self was conceived in ancient Greece, for instance, as a notion of a caring for oneself, a caring for self, and how it transformed then through Christianity and whatnot. So I think basic genealogy tries to like capture how different forms of like subjectivity and rationality was present in different historical times, that is probably completely different or like in a way unintelligible to us from our framework, from our conception of subjectivity and rationality and whatnot.
Yeah, no, it was just, I'm still puzzled about the same thing. So when Adnan was talking about modernity, I was thinking if you could understand that, these traces of modernity as a brushwork, as an expressive function of image now. It's like it has a relation with materiality of now, but inseparable of the symbolic or expressive function. And related to what Ella is saying, I think this is precisely what was puzzling me, how to separate the expressiveness from the representative. Because at some point, for example, to talk about again of the scientific images, I don't know, in the 18th century, we had the botanical drawings that now we can say there is an artistic expression that nowadays they are different. Now we can look back at these type of drawings and say now there is something expressive there. So to draw the line between the representative and the expressiveness, there is something on the side on the beholder too, or
I agree
the social.
with that, but I also would be kind of a bit cautious with regards to this. I can see the paintings that were drawn in prehistoric times, and I recognize an animal. So there is a representative element that Jonas is talking about. And so the expressive element, sure, it is there because it has its own distinct, and usually I recognize it in retrospect. So I'm blind to my own.
I'm not denying this. I'm saying that it's difficult to draw the line, actually.
I mean, can't we draw the line with the definition that Adnan provided in the beginning of the presentation of an intentional, what was it? An intentional incomplete likeness. Like the expressive dimension doesn't have, you're not trying to express your style. You're trying to express a figure through the style.
But for example, in the example that Seb gave at the beginning, in the digital media, we can find this superimposed expressive function, and it's not necessarily the intention at the beginning, at first, as the same occurs to the drawings of the botanical pictures in the past, for example.
Yeah, I think that maybe different attitudes or stances you take towards this also is one of the criteria that then ends up differentiating different modalities or different disciplines and arts. So, you know, even though you might not be able to do it, at least you can aspire to, for instance, to really try to minimize the expressive element without necessarily knowing that, you might not be able to do well, that in a certain sense, fundamentally, you cannot completely not do it, but you really try to explore this element of, you know, this image stands for a certain something, and this is the thing that you're interested in. On the other hand, you can really explore more the way it is given, you know, and it can be very subjectively colored in the sense of, you know, how I am expressed in this happening, or it can be just in line with the overall style that is present and that you're trying to kind of encapsulate. So one of the things, like this is like a very, very interesting thing, the topics that we've raised here, this question of epistemological ruptures, but also the idea of, you know, one thing I definitely don't agree with is that, for instance, you have an episteme that is hermetically closed to you. Like I disagree with that. This is, you know, I think that there is precisely this capacity of transcontextuality and shifting of contextuality, and this is what makes you a minded creature. But on the other hand, there is, in my view, no disputing the fact that you have these types of very strong connections between, let's just focus for simplicity's sake on the technological. The technological factors, for example, and what it means to be reasonable. Yeah. And you yourself are kind of embedded in one such framework. So what does this mean? So this I find interesting. I have an idea about this. I'm not going to expound it here. It basically then relies on a conceptual distinction between mind and spirit, not a very popular distinction nowadays, but it is the spiritual capacity, which is precisely the capacity to break through the context, so to engage or initiate the movement of recontextualization, which is the crucial key, which is the crucial element of being able to have this type of universality, which, however, is always then ends up grounded when it tries to articulate itself in some sort of framework. So, you know, you cannot speak from the level of the spirit. And I know that this sounds weird because there are a lot of connotations to this word, but I think that this is something that is very interesting. And incidentally, the first time I started thinking about this, like very, very seriously, is, and we haven't been mentioning him enough, I think. No, I'm actually very happy that we didn't. I really would like to avoid this idea of, say, Jonas being this slightly retarded brother of Merleau-Ponty. This is not a good way to proceed, and I would like to dodge this. But in this particular case, it does matter, because in the structure of behavior, I did come across this duality. So this dual aspect, you know, that the mindedness has a double movement. On the one hand, it anchors itself in a cultural milieu, but on the other hand, it always kind of transgresses us. It's above it. So this for me was like, wow, this is very interesting. So yeah, I do, however, I have to say, like, I really like this particular chapter and the emphasis on image making and basically what it opens up, the whole conceptual horizon and the sphere. It seemed to me very, very intriguing.
One thing, first of all, really good work on the expression of Jonas being the slightly retarded brother of Malobenti. That was
Sometimes this is the way he's depicted, and I really don't appreciate it. He's a like, whenever I read him, now that we were reading this particular chapter, I was like, there's so much wealth in this author. It's such a pity that he usually gets boiled down to these two chapters, for example, that are about, that have to do with life and metabolism, and the rest is just ignored. When we were doing the census chapter previously, and this time when we were reading this about image, like there's so much wealth in the way he goes about analyzing these topics.
Isn't this one? I found this chapter much richer than the previous chapters because it feels like
the previous one.
Profound
I don't know. You were absent in the previous. I don't know if you read it or not, but it's like they're very similar. They're very similar and they're extremely rich. Extremely rich. Yeah. But anyway, Adnan. Yeah.
Yep. Now, the other thing is, with this whole issue of the impenetrability of different mental frameworks. Now, just recently, when we were talking about these shifts, these epistemic shifts, the question was whether progress is gradual or it is discontinuous. But these two options don't really exhaust the entire sphere of possibilities, do they? So maybe the whole idea, the supposition that at whatever pace these shifts are occurring, that they are unequivocally a case of progress towards a clearer, better, higher resolution image of the world. Maybe that is not completely self-evident, and maybe that's the reason why, if we accept that kind of a presupposition, then of course the thought world of Plotinus is going to be completely inaccessible to us, because we're going to reduce anything in there that seems strange to some kind of a primitive or crude version of something we have today. Now, one can find myriad examples of this all over the place. I don't know, like any kind of a naturalist or pop science explanation of religion and mythology. That's a beautiful place to find that. We didn't know this and that, and therefore Plato did that and this and that. But now, fortunately, we know everything. So we know that the notion of the ideas was just some kind of a very, very rudimentary attempt at doing what neuroscience, I suppose.
Psychologizing.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I think this presupposition that our view that what is happening is indubitably and unequivocally progress, that is problematic. There are plenty of authors and there are plenty of traditions that don't really see it that way. It's not clear that it's progress. Of course, progress in certain respects, I don't know, in the material respect, depending again on how one understands wealth and everything. But in a certain way, things are changing for the better. But yeah, that one could say that that's essentially mostly a type of quantitative improvement, quantitative progress.
This was your second question, right, Sebastian? Like the first question we've now kind of addressed and explored a bit, and the second question, like of rationality being subjective and relative, does that mean it's also purely contingent? You said basically there's generality. Your second question is, does it then move towards an optimal endpoint or progress?
Yeah, and not necessarily even that. So for instance, I'm not necessarily saying that it has to have like this particular, but ultimately it might be the case that this is indeed what is implied. But what I was just suggesting, or what I was after, was the question whether, you know, if you have these different types of, say, frameworks or contexts, whether you can say that one is better than the other. And what Adnan was saying now, maybe it's a multi-dimensional question. So, you know, maybe the answer is not, and I'm not trying to dodge the question now by saying this, but maybe the question does in fact require you to say, yes, it can, with regards to specific parameters.
Exactly. Yeah, so if I can just add one comment to that based on my study of Merleau-Ponty, he says that so he thinks along these similar lines, and then he says that there is we can organize different perspectives, different frameworks, at least with respect to how broadly they can account for other frameworks, how broadly they can situate other frameworks and understand them and grasp them. And if that is our criterion, our norm, then we can say that certain ways of thinking are more closed to other perspectives, more resistant to them, less capable of getting them. And certain other frameworks are more open, more able to place other frameworks in their own and make sense of them. And in this sense, I think like a scientific way of thinking, broadly construed, one which is critical, inquisitive, curious, is one which is more encompassing and can make sense of other viewpoints to a greater extent. And in this sense, we might say that it is better in a certain sense.
I would just, yeah, in one aspect, I would take issue with that. If we talk about the scientific viewpoint there, now, of course, if we take it as some kind of an ideal example of inquisitiveness, then maybe. But what is typical, my concern is the way that most people would understand this would be to say, okay, we have science and everything, and now we know, we can understand, we can situate Plato with his naive little attempt at psychology. We know what he was doing. We can accommodate him. We can situate him. We can integrate him. We understand him. We understand, I don't know, we understand Nagarjuna. We know what he was trying to do because we've got, you know, we've got empirical science. So we know he was just trying to sort of tease out something that we've got in a much better form. So the point is, it's very easy to say that a culture can accommodate, or a framework can accommodate others, where in reality all it's doing is treating them as its own more than slightly, sometimes much more than slightly retarded versions. So I think that would be a bit of a, I don't think that it's,
yeah, no, I totally agree also, totally agree. So it has to be nuanced a lot to make sense of it. And I do think this making sense of other viewpoints has to be done by situating yourself in their horizons, kind of taking their perspective also, not just adopting theirs into your own.
Yeah, in that sense, I would say that I don't think that one framework can accommodate another. I don't think it's possible for one culture to completely open itself for another. But what is necessary is that the individual needs to somehow slowly start to see things in a different way according to a different framework. That's not easy. And the best illustration of that, I don't know, it was a British author, I think 19th century, that mentioned that. But like the difference between a good tourist and a bad tourist. You know, nowadays we can think of the stereotypical bad American tourist. You know, they'll go to Italy and have complain that the pizza isn't good, but it's because it's not like they get at Domino's. That's the bad tourist. And that's the way a lot of people approach other frameworks, whether it's other civilizations or, of course, ancient eras, other times. Whereas what one should do is try to be a good tourist, try to see what this thing is, try to see how the people that inhabit that thought space live, and try to see what they're trying to do. And of course, with a very, very crucial epoché of one's own presuppositions from the culture one was raised in, and that's extremely difficult to do.
But in terms of this better or worse, and in terms of the progress of perspectives, is this very idea that you're suggesting that we should do this, is this not a kind of progress in terms of, I don't know, philosophy of trying to understand other cultures? Isn't this kind of a gain of the Western framework, that we recognize our own relativity and come to appreciate the difference in other cultures? So maybe this is a sign of a progress.
I mean, I just wanted to say that also talking about progress and better and worse, even in connection with rationality, also again has to do with how rational beings, which are all human beings, are treated, right? So if you have a system, a framework which rationalizes slavery, is, I would say, in like a worse framework regarding the very concept of rationality, because it denigrates a part of the rational populace to a lower, like a lower race or whatnot. And so in this way, of course, there is progress in like also in rationality, in the bettering of basically that more rational agents are freer to actually like participate in the framework making in a way.
This is really interesting. I would like to complicate matters further. And this is something that I was reminded of when Atul was kind of saying that we've had the first question covered and now we moved to the second, but in some ways I think it's related. So two things I would just like to mention, and then we can either get into those or we can move into the question of progress as well, which is a very interesting one. So for instance, you've had two ideas that I would like to kind of interconnect. And the first one I will be a bit shady about or unclear because I can't remember the details. But
maybe you should wear your hoodie again.
Yeah. Okay, for this one I'm going to do it. So you had like 3 centers where the logics developed in Greece and in India and in China. And the thing was that they were very different logics. Especially the Chinese one was like an odd man out because it's usually described as a like a qualitative or an analogical logic, and the way the reasoning that it was kind of allowed was something that was explicitly forbidden in the Aristotelian logics. And for example, the Aristotelian logics and the Indian logics, they differed as well because they had the Indian didn't have certain syllogisms, and the way it presented some seemed to be perhaps potentially wrong in Aristotelian, or it could be translated into something else. However, they were kind of the founding stone or foundational stone or the beginning of a certain, you know, tradition of reasoning, of an attempt of formalized, organized reasoning within that tradition. And, you know, I would like to just ask you what you think about this. And this ties in with a slightly broader question or remark. Namely, you know, we have an author who is not particularly popular in contemporary academy, Spengler, who wrote the famous text about the decline or basically falling apart of the West. And he has this idea that cultures have their foundational metaphors or foundational images, yeah? And depending on what this, I can now put the hoodie down, depending on what this, say, image or metaphor is, will determine like this, the most general, almost like a tacit horizon within which it will develop. So I can't remember now the specific details, but depending on, you know, how you're going to conceive of yourself as a group will then feed into the steps that you will make. So all the small modifications and changes, which will then trickle down and will modify into larger structures, will be related to that. So he is defending a very polycentric conception of human culture, and for him the idea of progress or of one culture being better than the other is just false. And he has, as you probably know, like he has this famous or infamous idea of the cyclical structure of these cultures, you know, where they kind of have specific stages they go through and eventually they end up in the period of decline. So these two questions, they are in a certain sense interrelated. So I would just, like to hear what you think of this, because it has the element of image in it, Jonas, so image. And then the question of the idea of having, for example, 3 different logics crop up and what it means is an interesting question. So might one say that the Aristotelian one is the best one because it can account for the other ones as well, whereas, for example, the Chinese one would not be able to do the same for the Aristotelian one, and the Indian is somewhere in between? Or would we just say that they are in this regard different, and how this ties in with the notion of the more, let's say, universal general rationality and whatnot?
Didn't even like Carnap in the later writings say that the decision which formal system to use is at the end an aesthetic choice, so that there is no like better formal system than the other, but at the very end that it's more of a choice of aesthetic than like reason. But the second thing, another perspective would be so I'm not sure, but in philosophy of language, I think you have this sort of, you know, language and meta language, right? And meta language has to be expressively stronger if it is going to be a meta language of that language, because it has to be a language in which you can talk about the lower language, right? So it has to be expressively stronger in order for you to do that. And so I don't know, these are like two opposing views that I don't know how to mishmash together.
The thing is, I think that the problem in general is also with this Carnapian approach is that, in a certain sense, it could be said to be an aesthetic or a pragmatic thing. But ultimately, with the development, for example, of symbolic logics, it turned out, you know, how clunky and faulty Aristotelian syllogismic logic was. So saying this then basically, you know, would in a certain sense undermine the development of the very movement that Carnap was a part of. So again, I think it's more of almost like a political statement than a statement of something that would be anchored in what he is actually doing, so that the subject matter that he's involved with.
I think maybe to comment on your first question, we can also make the comparison, instead of comparing different logics of different cultures, within science, different time frames and the logics developed in those time frames. And there it's, I think, clearer that, for example, the current state of physics is more complete, more encompassing than an earlier stage of physics. And in that sense, there's a more clearer way in which we can discern that things have become better, more encompassing. So at least that validates the point that there is a directionality to logic that can become more general and more complete. I think when we compare different cultures, the question becomes quite a lot more tricky and complicated, but maybe this adds some juice to the discussion.
I think Jonas actually says that he kind of tries to avoid these more controversial topics and focuses on image making for precisely this reason, because it's easier to compare it across cultures, and it is actually omnipresent, and you don't see this much differentiation actually in image making. The caveman in one part of the world is going to be depicting the bison in a strangely similar manner. And so maybe, yeah, he has a good point here. Maybe this is a good starting point, a better starting point to go from image making and try to develop other things from that, rather than trying to skip a few steps and try to say, okay, how different logic systems develop. Maybe that's too ambitious.
Or would it be something along the lines of similar to what we said with regards to image making, that there is a tendency to have a structured line of thought, which then in specific, and it's dependent on the cultural, social milieu as such. However, the way it will manifest and actualize itself will be dependent on the very specific particularities of a group, of a context in which it finds itself, and several other, like many other factors that are involved in this. This could be also one way, so to have this bilateral distinction again. Because with regards to what you said, so first of all, I really don't know that much about cave paintings in different parts of the world, but one thing that did that I was reminded of was so for example, the very specific standards in drawing that developed, for instance, in Japanese culture and in the Western culture, and just on the very fundamental level, like even if we ignore the details, the question of the empty space and the filled space. So, you know, the element of emptiness for various reasons became like a very, very important segment in the paintings. And then as this happened, this kind of impacted, in a certain sense, development of a very specific style, you know, because through the materiality itself. So I don't know, again, it's an interesting
I would
thing.
also provoke Jonas in a different manner. What if these explorers of his were blind and sight was unknown to them? In what manner would they get to know of this species that the human is? Or to put this another way, how would he analytically proceed? How would his analysis differ if he started from a different sense? What if he started from hearing? For example, can all these ideas of his really be developed from hearing or applied to hearing? For example, image making. In what sense is are the sounds we try to make, singing and so forth, really mimesis, imitation, or something like that?
And what if they were, check this out, using echolocation or something like that? They were all bats, like the rat of bats.
Space, yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah,
the previous chapter gives us some clues there on how he would respond, I think, right? Because Jonas does think that this image faculty, this image function is unique to vision, and that it is through vision that it can spread to the other senses. That touch, for example, has an imaging function too, but that it draws it from a visual basis or from a visual foundation.
But say you have a blind person, and the blind person's cognitive development, how is it going to differ if it lacks the basic capacity that underlies the entire cognitive framework of the human, according to Jonas?
Well, wouldn't the blind person still have the structures, at least the nervous structures of a sighted person? So maybe that gives him still the foundation to image that then becomes taken up by other senses.
I think you are right in a way, pretty much, but again, I would say that it's not about image per se. I mean, maybe I didn't read the previous chapter, but it's about symbolic structures. So I mean, language and like words form like a, you know, like an image almost. It has it's at the same time it's a, you know, a sound, a material sound, like an image is a material thing, but at the same time it represents something. It
Yeah,
has
but he derives it from sight. I
Yeah.
think sight is the primary and the primordial source of this image making, and then it gets kind of develops into all the other kinds of symbolic activity. That's how I understood it.
Okay, but then again, there's like two different timelines of development. I mean, I'm not sure even if I agree with this, but talking about a blind person nowadays, he will always have, language already developed. So he will always already be thrown into a society where language and symbolic forms are already there. And so he will like get the symbolism from there. But if you're talking about development as in cavemen who do not speak yet but also can paint bisons, then that's a different story, because then you don't have this symbolic level already established, but it's a question of can you go from, I guess, the visual towards like words and whatnot. But even then I would be cautious, because I think interaction and sociality here will be again possibly more primary than like drawing in this sense, and possibly calls are more present even in animals, right? Animals communicate through sounds, not and so I would say that the image producing in this way might be a later development, but I have no idea what the like empirical evidence of this is.
The thing is, so this really ties in nicely with the previous chapter, and interestingly enough, if you remember, we had a similar discussion last time precisely about this, and the reasoning was basically very similar. So in a certain sense, for example, the person who is blind from birth but is embedded into the cultural context which provides it with all the things that you said, so the symbolic framework of sorts, will be in a better position to see than the person who has normal sight but is lacking this enculturation. So even though they can use the sight, there's not there. So the idea is basically that Jonas is trying to make is that the structure of the sight as a perceptual faculty is the one that is closest to the predominant modes of structuring and patterning in the human society as we know it. So it's the closest to the symbolic, and he provides really, really good reasons in that chapter. So just doing this will not cut it here, because he like provides three main arguments, and all of them have really, really good subsections. And he also provides very interesting comparisons to sound and touch. We were missing the smell, for instance, which would be also very interesting. But even regardless, so even if we can even epoché this, but this is the main idea. So it's not so much about the concrete development within a certain individual, but whether this individual as a human being has the entryway into the space, which is kind of structured in ways which have their germ, you might say, in the visual. So even if you don't have the visual capacity as a human being as a whole, you're kind of open to this way of engaging with the world, and this is something that is present in the sociality. So even if you're blind, but the question is not a good one, pretty much. It's not a bad one, pretty much, because the beings that would arrive, they would be different beings. So for them it's not necessary that they would have this. So then the question would be whether they would even get images. I don't know.
And maybe they would get soundages.
Atul, do you have an answer to this?
Well, just based on the chapter and the arguments he provides, I would think that sound as a sense doesn't have what it takes to develop into an image-giving function, because it doesn't have the distance, the presentation of a manifold, and the suppression of causality. Those are basically the three elements he gives in the chapter, which vision that has, and through which vision acquires the power to represent.
What about some kind of hypothetical, very advanced echolocation? Because if you think about the way that sonar or radar work, you know, like they can provide essentially those elements. So, you know, it's not impossible to imagine that an organism could have something like that.
I agree. Yeah,
I
I don't think
assume
Jonas reckoned with echolocation in that chapter.
But why would sound not be, why would sound be different? I mean, also echolocation is just a version of like sensing vibrations of a certain frequency. But why would echolocation be different from just like a length?
It's a very different thing, because with echolocation, what you have is you have a constant emitting of a certain sound that then you triangulate basically with regards to what you emit and what comes back. So for instance, there was this, I remember this was like ages ago. I was watching a documentary about a black boy who was born with some sort of a defect which resulted in him being blind. So he spontaneously, as a little kid, developed like some sort of an echolocation where he was able to play basketball and walk around, and he would do these like little clicks and then walk around. And he was even learning how to drive by having a head out of the window and doing that. But anyway, so the reason, so the way he's describing it in that particular chapter is that in a certain sense you're kind of missing this. So he's talking about the object intruding to you and you being a passive receiver with regards to this. So there are several things that he points out in that particular chapter, how sound differs from vision.
I'm gonna read that chapter so I can return to this. But
Good.
just as a side note, I was like almost a year ago, but not really. I was to this, it's not a summer school because it's in February or March, but anyhow, and they had like a workshop on echolocation actually. And you can, in fact, even as an adult, train yourself. So like you make this clicking sound, and of course at first you're very bad at it. It has to be a very high pitch clicking sound, so you have to first learn, and then you can like orient yourself in a place blindfolded, because you know, like you and you can describe then what types of images like you get from this, right? Because it's like training another, or like repurposing your sensory systems for another way of sensing. And so you have this presence of like flatness, or I don't know what, like, so but basically it's interesting that you can, as an adult person, actually at least acquire a tad bit of echolocation.
That's interesting. And by the way, this Atul, this would basically introduce this element of activity into the hearing that Jonas points out is one of the biggest problems with regards to what it's lacking with regards to vision, right? Because here you would have, it would not just be the intrusion of the object, but you would be doing something similar to the visual thing, where you basically also actively engage, so to speak, more actively engage in this regard.
Yeah.
I guess the problem with this echolocation thing is that it's much harder to disengage yourself as the subject from this whole process. The image is out there and you can kind of, I mean, it's not dependent on your activity to exist, this image. In such a strong sense as
compresence. Yeah. That's another
compared to because it's like some sound you'd have to produce to even be able to constitute the image. So I guess with inactivism, even an image is a mutual specification and two-way relation. So I don't know. We need a sci-fi writer to create this civilization of echolocating human bats.
I'm pretty sure that already exists, and that there are several volumes of sci-fi texts on this. We're just not familiar with that particular branch of literature. Okay, I think we've given this a fair go. Maybe we can wrap it up at this point.